Okay, so why this course? Well, it's not because I was born in a so-called socialist country and lived there for 12 years. Undoubtedly, that gives me a certain view of the matter, because not only did I live there for 12 years, but also I've come back many times and maintained a lot of friendships and participated even in some indirect, just come right away, indirect ways and even direct ways in Hungarian politics. But that's not the reason. Not that Hungary doesn't need a discussion around this topic, I think it also does. But nevertheless, I think the importance of the topic goes way beyond the politics and the contemporary regime of a very small, after a very small Central European country. I think it's fair to say, whether we're going to vote for him or not, that Bernie Sanders has reintroduced the topic as a serious one in US politics. And of course he could not have done it had it not been in a particular epoch, in a particular context. I mean, after all, he's been there as a congressperson and as a senator, I don't even know, 30 years or so, and he always called himself a socialist, a democratic socialist, and so he was not successful in getting others to say, like Ocasio-Cortez, that I am too a socialist, democratic socialist, and so on. In fact, the organization that Ocasio-Cortez belongs to was one that I actually belonged to at one point, the Democratic Socialists of America, founded by Michael Harrington and others. But that organization too was there all this time, so why not? Why now? That's the question. And I think it is fair enough to say that really three crises converge in making the topic relevant and giving Bernie Sanders a genuine chance in becoming American president, even though he uses that label, and others not so different than he, like Elizabeth Warren, have a chance also. That I think requires a triple crisis, and that crisis, the three components of it are, and I now use the term, although I resisted for a while, that of the neoliberal stage of capitalist development, which now I think even I see should be understood as a specific stage. Maybe when something comes toward the end, it's more possible to see it as a stage. Capitalism clearly had a liberal economic stage historically, which is the context of the emergence of a great deal of socialism. And then capitalism too has a state interventionist stage we associate. Those of you who haven't signed and came in late, please, Chandra, we'll get you to sign also. Had a state interventionist welfare state stage, which in the 1970s, and a lot of us talked about this back then, also entered into a period of crisis, maybe not as dramatic as the economic crisis of 1929, but still one that made the continuation of that form difficult, if not impossible, because after all, some Scandinavian countries managed to continue in that interventionist welfare tradition, of course some modifications. But still, a new stage in response to that emerged, and that's the neoliberal form, which all of you know is connected, and in different countries to different degrees, to things like privatization or reprivatization, things like deregulation, things like freeing international economic relations, free trade, or the freeing of trade, In some countries, the form that this was introduced, think of Chile, for example, in authoritarian or dictatorial ways, but in other countries it was the result of the transformation of political actors who previously were attached to the parameters of the welfare state and state interventionist form. That, I think, indicates the second crisis, the crisis of the welfare state or of social democracy. Again, the literature of 1970s points to it: Fiscal Crisis of the State by James O'Connor, Klaus Hofer's writings, Jürgen Habermas, Daniel Bell, even the coming crisis of capitalism. A lot of people wrote about it, but in fact, we know that there really was a crisis because of a very different form, the neoliberal post-interventionist form was consummated in lots of places. And what is striking is how many left actors were involved in that term. I mean, we give this different terms. After Anthony Giddens's book, it's sometimes called the third way. It can be called New Labor, New Democracy in the United States, the Clintons. Most poignantly for me, the ex-socialist parties of Central Europe, and not only they, also shifted in that direction. The German Social Democratic Party, more to the west, even at some stages, the French socialists have all adopted policies of this kind. Maybe Emmanuel Macron represents a late development of that trend in a country where previously it was not really consummated. But in any case, left-wing parties, left-wing voters, left-wing politicians played a role in the emergence of this third stage. And that indicates certainly the crisis of social democracy, which almost nowhere retained the kind of vitality that it had in the 30 glorious years, the Trente Glorieuses of the period after the Second World War. So the second crisis, the crisis of a version of socialism. And the third crisis is of course the crisis of authoritarian socialism, which is, as you see in my paper, if you get a chance to read it, is the second important, perhaps in world historical terms, the more important of the two versions in which socialism was institutionalized in the 20th century. I mean, if you look at the world's map, let us say in 1954 or 5, and you will see, yes, there are these social democratic pockets in very rich European countries, but the part of the world which is covered by authoritarian socialism is much greater. Well, maybe you can throw in a few big countries like India into the social democratic world. I mean, after all, influenced by Fabian socialism, so maybe the social democratic world is not quite as small as I just put it, but still, I remember in Hungarian history classes, we always talked about your country then. You were born in it still, or no?
No.
You were born after the Soviet Union. Was 1/6 of the world. That was the formula. 1/6 of the Earth's land mass. Then you throw in China, right? You really have a very large constellation. And it enters into a crisis which now has taken different forms in different places, but almost nowhere, with the exception of the die-hard regime of North Korea, almost nowhere else is it continued in that original form. So 3 crises. Now, of course, 2 of them, that of neoliberalism and that of state socialism, indicate the need to search for something new. But in the case of social democracy, namely democratic socialism, which I think entered into crisis, the link to both the course and to the desire to renew socialism is a little bit more indirect. Because after all, normatively one can still remain a social democrat, even now. But one, of course, may have some issues with how the social democratic policy is to be carried out. The problem, I think, goes further than that, and that's the point of my paper, which some of you had a chance to read, but obviously, you know, it's too early to expect that anybody really has done much reading for the course. It's the problem of populism. That is, it's not just that social democracy has ran out of answers, which after all, if you look hard enough, maybe they could find new ones, but their space is occupied by somebody else. That's the more serious matter. And that space is occupied in different settings by different versions of populism. This is not entirely unprecedented for the crises of capitalist systems. I don't know how many of you read Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. It's a very important book, which I think everybody really should read. I don't know if in our department we still have something like a basic reading list for students that everyone should read. We used to in the old days, but now he laughs. But now I doubt that many of my colleagues would. Benoit would certainly support it, but I'm not sure if many of the others would feel the need. But Karl Polanyi's book, I think, would be one thing that I would certainly put on the list. And Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, which is really about the problem of socialism just as much as it is the problem of the crisis of capitalism, suggests that in the 1930s, when something close to a collapse occurred in the world capitalist system, there was not just one alternative, but several. And those alternatives are, as you all know, certainly from the point of view of a country which is the original home of the 29 crisis, the New Deal, which attempts to not only manage the crisis, but also reconstruct capitalism in such a way that such crises in the future could be avoided. This is the Keynesian welfare state project, much more realized in Sweden, as you'll hear from Ross Poole later on in the course, than here, but still, even in the United States, that option was both theoretically and politically developed. But as you also know, German fascism, which is almost contemporaneous in terms of its origin with the New Deal, represents also a response to the crisis. And those who study the histories carefully, it's kind of sad to have to admit it, know that Hjalmar Schacht was a better crisis manager than anyone on Roosevelt's team. They dealt with the crisis quicker, more dramatically. Full employment was restored, and some welfare state measures, obviously for the ethnic, the true people who needed to be supported, were also generated. Now, the third option would be the most controversial. Polanyi, I think, has it, but doesn't stress it very much. And for me, it is a central one to mention in the context of this course, namely state socialism. Now, of course, you'll know that state socialism, the framework for it, the one-party rule, and the authoritarian transformation of society and culture, were initiated in the 20s. Perhaps we don't want to blame the Russian Revolution for all that. The February Revolution certainly implied the creation of quite a different political model than authoritarian state socialism. But even the first period of Leninism implied a different politics, and that is demonstrated by the fact that when Lenin ran into trouble, Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin ran into trouble with the state socialist formulas of the so-called war communism, the new economic policy was initiated, which involved experimenting with things that this course will talk about, namely different property relations and different coordination mechanisms. Now you know what property relations are, right? But coordination mechanisms is perhaps a new term. So market and state and self-management represent three ways of managing economic life on an organizational level. And the 1920s represented experimentation with all those three forms. But what is amazing is that in the period of the collapse of the classical capitalist framework elsewhere, in Russia too there is a turn, and it's almost contemporaneous with the New Deal and National Socialism. And in many respects, this is what the totalitarianism school has always argued, many of its political forms converge with that of fascism. And actually, Italian fascism, about which I'm not going to say much, also goes through a radical shift toward the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s. So the shift to state interventionism, to more state, less market, less certainty in all these settings, no self-management. Maybe it's a bit of an issue because the unions retain some powers under fascism, much more even in a way than under state socialism. But in any case, a shift to a state-organized form of society, and some people, some writers actually talk about state capitalism, even in the Soviet case. So that turn occurred, and what I'm stressing that it occurred in three quite distinct political forms, namely authoritarian socialist, fascist, based on a national and racist principle of exclusion, and an organized capitalism of the welfare state form are the three forms. And what I think we are encountering now in a situation of if not entirely parallel, then at least analogical crisis and tension, is again the possibility, the emergence of an alternative set of forms of reconstruction. And I would say that at the moment, versions of relatively conservative neoliberalism and in populism are the most important of the options, and so far we have not seen the reconstruction of a left-wing version. Now, why not populism itself? There are some writers, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, Nancy Fraser, who were all friends of mine, recommend all their writings, and in case of Professor Fraser, her courses too. They think that the two versions of populism exhaust that spectrum of possibilities in the current crisis. So you could have a continuation and even radicalization of neoliberalism. I think probably one would have to say that it would take an increasingly authoritarian form if that version was going to continue. And then left and right populism correspond in some way to, there's some chairs, of the choices back then. So in a sense, and this is what my colleague Federico Finkelstein has long argued, at least a version of populism, he would say all populisms, but I would say only a version of populism, you agree with me on this, can be seen as a fascism, ersatz fascism, a replacement of fascism in an epoch in which fascism in a classical version is no longer politically possible. I'm not so sure whether exactly in the area of the world which he works on, that political formulas relatively close to fascism had not emerged. Another important author on this subject, Gino Germani, has, for example, always considered the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes to be pretty fascistoid in their structure. But in any case, for this type of argument, populism is the authoritarian formula for certain elites and especially charismatic leaders who, because of the world context and because of political development, can no longer impose fully fascist solutions. I would add to Federico's conception, though, that authoritarian socialism itself has become extremely difficult to advocate in the contemporary setting. I am sure that there's some politicians, sects, I would say more than even serious political figures, in lots of parts of the world who would still maintain the classical authoritarian socialist formula, namely the leadership of the vanguard party, the nationalization of all property, the replacement of market by planning. I doubt that have not been very much in touch with contemporary Trotskyist movements. I was, of course, more in the 60s when they were important political actors on the American New Left. I doubt that any of them really would advocate that classical combination. But still, I don't exclude that there are people who still would maintain. Let's hope one of our faculty members doesn't come and say what socialism is collective ownership of all. Well, it's already two formulas, right? Means of production, property. It's two quite different things. But in any case, either version would be surprising if it were advocated, but it could still be. And of course, the replacement of market relations by centralized planning. In any case, those who used to hold positions like that on the left have also sought for political alternatives. And the most interesting case of that for me is Ernesto Laclau, whose work I have used and whom I knew. So I think you've taken a course with him, with Laclau, so you actually knew him. Laclau comes from strong state socialist, authoritarian socialist background. And then under the influence of many people, he has shifted, but in his last words, he introduced populism as a kind of, at least in my interpretation, you may disagree, as a kind of voluntaristic elite position which no longer has a class to base future hopes on. In any case, these three options today, neoliberalism continued in one form or another, in its crisis, probably in a more authoritarian form increasingly. Populism, and then of course populism on the right, which would be then the substitute for right-wing authoritarianism or radical nationalism. Now, I think the weight on those who now are talking about socialism, and I'm speaking about myself first and foremost, is to evaluate these options and to try to think about alternatives, either in the sense that Nancy Fraser and Chantal Mouffe have, is choose the good populism against the bad one, which is I think what they have done, or in my case, to try to consider what fourth political option would be would be possible in a contemporary setting. And of course, it would be of course possible. And after all, Saint-Simon did it. In some sense, Marx did it. Proudhon did it. Invent something new, right? And I could claim that yes, we have a fourth, and here it is, right? And then I could outline in 14 lectures what that is. I mean, you're smiling, right? Because of course I can't, and I doubt that anyone can. It is probably one of the curses of modernity is that we are so reflective about traditions that we can only formulate even the new in terms of reconstructing traditions. And that is even in a sense true for what I said about populism on both the left and right. Whether in the case of Perón, who reconstructed fascism in an entirely new way, or in the case of Laclau, who reconstructs Leninism in an entirely new way, we reconstruct. In any case, we shouldn't be embarrassed about it because that's what we do at the new school. I know that when you click in the new school website, the first thing that you'll likely encounter is a quotation from John Cage, namely that he's only afraid of the old ideas and he's only interested in new ones. I don't like his music at all, by the way. And so to the extent that I have to choose between Beethoven and John Cage, or even Schoenberg and John Cage, I have no doubt that I don't like the new. But you know, if you're 75 years old, you probably don't like the new quite as much as most of you guys. So perhaps I'm wrong about this. And perhaps I should have invented something like John Cage's music of discourse, which, by the way, one of the best-known pieces of it is 20 minutes of total silence. Well, you could call this course 14 weeks of total silence. But instead, I think we need to speak about a tradition. And the thing about this tradition, and I think this goes against my paper, and I'm looking at Benoit because I know that this is one of his objections to the paper if he actually had a chance to read it. But I will now agree with what he would say, is that in the paper I just stress two dimensions of the tradition. The one founded by Edward Bernstein, and the other founded by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, they were great men. No one can deny that they are really, of course, they don't invent something like John Cage's 20 minutes of silence, because they are in fact reflecting on socialism. And Bernstein was a close collaborator of Friedrich Engels, and Lenin was a very, very careful reader of these things. So, of course, they are not just inventing something entirely new, but there's some dramatic departures in their works in relationship to these traditions. I'm just reading a book by you read everything, Benoit, and he too. These two people read everything. Franco Venturi, 800 pages on Russian populism, the origins of revolution, Russian populism, and you find in it how much Lenin has taken also from another tradition, the Russian populists, like skipping of stages is a typical classical Russian populist idea that you see in Herzen, Chernyshevsky. Sorry, Getsen, you would say, right, in Russian, because can't be pronounced if you're from there. But in any case, they are reflecting on traditions and are creating something on those bases. But my objection to myself, now saying what Benoit would say, is that these are not, by any means, the only traditions of socialism. And just because they are victorious, that I think no one can deny, that social democracy and Bolshevism have victories like other socialist traditions do not. You know, we can celebrate the commune which I think we will talk about with Chiara next week a little bit because of the issue of Proudhon and Marx and their debates. We can celebrate the Commune, but we know it lost. And we can celebrate the Soviets, but we know that they are dismantled or totally transformed. Only the name really is left from the 1905 or the 1917 February version. But with Walter Benjamin, we should not accept the idea that only the winners are interesting. And that would be the criticism of my paper, is that I'm focusing on the winners and the end of their traditions, which you can no longer continue. But might it not be that at a time when the tradition of the winners has become problematic, and I don't say every single aspect of them become problematic, because I think there's a lot to learn even from Lenin and Bernstein still. But still, when their traditions become problematic, why not try to rediscover some of the other traditions? And you'll see that in this course, both on the level of theory, for example, the role of Proudhon will be highlighted from an early time on, but Council Communism, which is independent tradition and emerged, but you've written on it. So I think probably one could say that it emerged in the Russian context perhaps before 1900, but certainly it becomes an important political force from 1905 on, and yet it does not in most cases succeed. And anarchism, which I neglect, but I think that if this course gets a continuation, which I actually am quite interested in, the relationship of anarchism and socialism should be an important topic as well, and even the neglected utopians, who I will neglect, except for the one essay of Engels which criticizes them. There could be very interesting things in Fourier and Owen and Saint-Simon, and probably many others that we could recover. And if we are thinking of how to go from where we are, then I think we must not only think about the crisis of the present, which is of course significant, but also what we can draw on in order to help us come up with something new and something better. And I think this also means, beyond the famous names I just mentioned, that, yeah, I mean, let's look at Cuban socialism too. Just because some of us are very, very critical of its authoritarian aspects does not mean that there is no part of the experience that should not be taken seriously. And this, of course, means even the history of the people's democracies. The course already has a section on Yugoslavia, but I think, as I already just said, I will ask Gabriel to see if he wants to do something for us on Cuba. We would certainly find room for it. I'm just looking at the time, maybe 10 more minutes maximum. A little more on this populist topic, to which I will not return in this course. Some of you have taken a course with me already dealing with populism, called Populism and Civil Society. The issue was not at that moment socialism, but you know, why not left populism? That's really the question. Now, there is right off a terminological problem. The terminological problem has to do with the fact that in the United States, because of agrarian radicalism of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that was called populism, even an American People's Party was formed. Populism has always had an intrinsically and staunchly democratic form. This is not true, by the way, if you read Venturi's book. It's very big and very long, and obviously it's not for this class, but it should be for your reading list, you'll see that although in Russian populism of the 19th century, there are very important democratic strains, there's also a Jacobin authoritarian strain, which even led to terrorism and the end of the movement until it was then reconstructed subsequently by, again, democratic parties. Interestingly enough, the social revolutionaries were a populist party, understood themselves as such. So traditional populism, what I will follow Finkelstein called proto-populism, was a way of attempting to democratize existing forms of democracy. So why not that version of populism as an alternative to both neoliberalism and the right-wing version? Well, in order to make that point, of course, and my paper does that, I try to identify what I mean by populism, which of course cannot be identical to what people call populism. You know, to me, I don't recognize Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders very much as populists, except, you know, that they're Americans and they are influenced by American traditions and history. So what I call populism has to be defined in a different way. Now, instead of fighting the battle of definitions with a variety of authors, I use Laclau's work to define populism. It's an old trick from critical theory. You know, you don't come up with your own understanding of what contemporary capitalism is, and this is their interpretation of Marx. No, you use Adam Smith and Ricardo to tell you what the system is, and then you show what is wrong with it, or what its logic is that Smith and Ricardo and Jean-Baptiste and the others did not understand. Well, this is what I try to do with populism, and my definition works like that. And if it excludes many things called populism, then so be it. I'm not concerned with those things. But surprisingly, what Laclau defines as populism applies both to the left and right-wing versions. He himself is on the left, but he understands, as he calls it in his own language, which is not strange to some of you, maybe strange to others here, the floating signifier, that you could move from a left populism to a right one easily and vice versa. And in fact, he knew this was the case, for example, in France, where Le Pen gets voters from also ex-left-wing voters. And indeed, Trump, even in the United States, might have gotten votes from strong unionists and people who might have, I don't want to say that Obama is very much on the left, but still who were previously voters for the left wing of the Democratic Party. So the definition applies to both left and right populism. And as you see in the paper, I'm not going to now sum it up. You have, it's in an outline form, so you can actually look it up very easily. It has a few components. The stress on popular sovereignty as a neglected dimension of liberal democracy, and that should be realized as an important norm. I kind of agree with that, actually, but of course it depends on what you mean by sovereignty and what you mean by the people. The idea that a part of the people can stand for the whole, an idea that I actually have strong reservations about. The idea that one part can be spoken for by a charismatic leader, or at least leadership, which again I find problematic. The idea that society is to be understood in terms of a dualistic frame in which the people so understood, incorporated in the discourse of a leader and represented by one part of the people, encounters an enemy, a fundamental antagonist in society. This is the most problematic part of the analysis, which is derived from Carl Schmitt's idea of friend-enemy relations, and the idea that the task of a politics so understood is to refound the political order and to break with its previous oligarchic features. I have least problems with the first and last part of this, but very serious issues with the part whole, with the charismatic leadership and the friend-enemy part of this overall scheme. But without mentioning my objections, since this course is about various socialist traditions, I'd like to cite Slavoj Žižek, with whom I don't agree on lots of things, but who at this point is pretty clear that these ideas, the friend-enemy relationship, the part whole and the charismatic part, are inimical to any Marxism. Now, Lacan no longer says he's a Marxist, so it is not in itself an imminent criticism of him, but I think one could go further and say that almost all the socialist traditions that there are in their classical forms, and this is true for the utopians, it is true for Marxism, it is true for Proudhon, it is true for the Council of Communists, it is true for Bernstein, do not adopt these three perspectives. That doesn't mean, of course, that the various socialist traditions don't generate leaders with whom there are charismatic relations. But still, socialism is always embarrassed about that. I mean, we know that from Khrushchev's speech, the cult of personality. What is Stalin's crime? Is the cult of personality. Of course, a personality cult kind of develops around Khrushchev himself, but still, the idea that that's an embarrassment is there. And of course, friend-enemy, yes, there is an enemy, but that enemy is not one with whom you have a Schmidian relationship. We want to perhaps change the other, maybe even in the worst versions, re-educate the other, and I know that that has a very horrible sound because of historical experiences, but they are not. The proletariat, as Marx already said, not only is the part that speaks for the whole, but that has needs which are also the needs of everybody else. It's hard for a capitalist to recognize, perhaps, but they need to be also free of capitalism. That's a classic idea of the socialists, is that the master is, and Hegel, of course, already has this for slavery, the master is just as unfree as the slave. Well, this is not the logic which is introduced by the various populist schools. So it should not be surprising that as against the largely democratic ideology of Marxism, and I would say even the people's democracies don't call themselves people's democracies for no reason at all. Democracy is still a norm, even in countries which are very undemocratic and authoritarian. That democratic norm of all the socialisms distinguishes it from populism. Populism, in the left-wing version, can of course be based on a critique of existing forms of democracy, and it can even mean that it will present itself as a reconstruction of democracy, but a model which identifies the part with the whole by its very nature cannot be fully democratic. So again, then I would say that the choice of left populism, if it's not only a question of a term, but choosing populism in a serious way, and I would not say actually that either Nancy or Chantal would make an overly strong argument for the Lacloyan version, which I just generated. Still, the choice of populism, even terminologically, is not the right one. So socialism. Before I say a few words about the course, which will be very few, there is, of course, a terminological question here too. You know, when people like Ocasio-Cortez, after having identified herself as socialist, speak about the Green New Deal, there's a reason for that. We are not free in our use of terms, because the terms have a lot of meanings to a lot of other people. I have not fully decided whether I would vote for Warren or for Sanders. I know that people in the class will go for Sanders, and the faculty on the whole will go for Warren. I think the fact that he identifies himself as a socialist and she says, I'm a capitalist to my core, it may piss some of you off, but actually it's strategically not insignificant. It's not insignificant strategically. I mean, one thing you got to do if you're in politics, and I think all of you, some of you will be in politics, all of you probably have some interest in it. Politics is also a competitive phenomenon. You're not there only to make beautiful statements about the world or to sound great, expounding some theory or another. You're also there to win. And I think in the current setting, I don't know how strongly you guys feel this, in the current setting, winning is very important, especially because it's becoming a worldwide phenomenon, right? And the United States is such an important country that what happens here affects other places. So for example, Orban's success in Hungary doesn't depend fully on Trump surviving, but Trump surviving helps. And I think it would be important for lots of places where the issue is not decided to have an American experience which ends in a dramatic failure. And so in that sense, the fact that she tries to also modify her rhetoric according to the voters' interest is not absurd. But even theoretically, I mean, does it really make sense to try to promulgate socialism as a concept? And I have some doubts about it. But putting those doubts apart, the course will happen. And if it's successful, which doesn't depend on politics, but only on your participation and your interest, we will offer another section in it, maybe a year from now, which will turn to neglected topics and perhaps develop some of the topics we already have touched on. That in itself is that's a difference,
right?
Right. That is, it has no ends except vague ideas about. Now you're in power. It's not me. It's you, and so you'll do what you want. You're the people, right? So why should I now tell you? That's, that's a very significant difference, and we could. I left out. I said 6, and I left out 1, and I did leave out just this one. So learn what is called by Kees Modé and Kaltwasser a thin ideology, what Laclau calls a chain of equivalences. Populism does not really tell you what its own values, its own norms, its own goals are. It tries to bring together a variety of heterogeneous views into an understanding that we are all acting on the social terrain together. But that's significantly different than all socialisms. Well, not all socialisms. I didn't go into all the similarities between some socialisms and populisms, but isn't this a populist dimension of Edvard Bernstein's the movement is everything and the goal is nothing? So there is a version of democratic socialism which also has ruptured this tension between minimum and maximum program, as I call it in the paper.
But with Bernstein, there's no question that the values of socialism are still his. I think that if we studied him, and he has, of course, many more writings as see on this Marxist archive, this website, we will see that probably solidarity, political freedom, equality are still his values. So even if he doesn't have a goal in terms of a organization of society as a structural frame, he at least has norms, values, which should be realized. Certainly, Laclau will deny that populism has such values. Now, is that, of course, entirely true? I mentioned Mode, the idea of thin ideology. Mode has also a concept of host ideologies. Because populism is thin, in almost every setting, it also tries to piggyback on, it's almost like parasite and host, piggyback on some other ideology, which has much more substantive content. You see this in a dramatic way in Russia in the 19th century. I mean, every populist, whether it's Herzen or Chernyshevsky, or even the terrorists later, are socialists in terms of if they get a chance to say what they're for, it's going to be some version of socialism. What they mean by it could be Saint-Simon in one case, Proudhon in another case, but socialism is certainly, as a matter of fact, it's not the other possibility, nationalism, because that belongs to the other side. It belongs to the authoritarians in Russia in the 19th century. So socialism could be a host ideology, and nationalism can be another. And as Gene Cohen and I argue, and you can see this in some settings, in yours, for example, in Iran, even religion, Islamism can be, and Turkey, where is Chan? Even religion can be in your place. See, we have several of you who are from a place where religion has been relied on. And now I don't want to commit myself, although he has in a paper, to the leadership being populist, but you certainly have said that about Ahmadinejad. And I think that at least some people, I don't know if that's you, Chan, but Ertuğrul Tombus certainly interprets Erdogan as a populist leader who, of course, obviously uses religion. Also nationalism. By the way, the host ideologies need not be just one. It can be an eclectic combination of different things. And so in that sense, socialism, all socialisms are different than populism because they really do have a normative frame, which actually both authoritarian socialists and democratic socialists sometimes even share, and then some idea of a societal frame, which would be an ideal place of realization of the socialist norms and ideas. The populists can have such frame, but shifting among them is extremely easy, which is what the concept of people constructed by populists so easily allows. So someone like Perón, correct me of course if I'm wrong about him, this is at least what Federico says, Perón can be basically a fascist gentleman in terms of its origins, personally. But he learns from social democracy, right? And in that sense, though he begins with, and nationalism is part of his electoral campaigns too. So fascism, nationalism, and even a version of socialism can be relied on. In that sense, populism is freer than socialisms are, but of course it's more dangerous because if you shift from, let's say, French communism to Le Pen, it means you're shifting to a formula that could have devastating implications for important population groups of the same country. If you're a communist, generally you have other problems, but you are not racist. in the French Communist Party. But now you're joining a formation that clearly uses race and religion as a mobilizing. Well, there's two questions, and very briefly, because one, you're going to talk about yourself.
Yeah.
Although I think Anne and you are on together, so in some ways, well, you'll have two different views on the subject of the colonies, the role of the colonies, how the colonies respond, and so on. I think the thesis which you're outlining is that the version of capitalism which allowed the socialist ideas first to emerge, which are basically in England and France, was itself possible because of the colonial expansion of those two European countries. And in that sense, as everything else, it is affected by that colonial privilege and that colonial exploitation. And with the end of colonialism, not only this version of capitalism enter into crisis, but this version of socialism too. I will let you make that argument, but I have a little bit of skepticism about it, and it comes from the fact that after all, such colonials as Nehru and Nyerere actually choose socialism themselves, and it is much more general than that, of course, all the way down to Ho Chi Minh, and of course at some level you could say even in China. I mean, after all, it's not a colony, but given the spheres of influence in China, it's a country which is also colonized. So there is a kind of the colonial in many settings, and I would be everyone, you'd have to really read Fanon to see what extent it's true for him. Many whom you recommend. The colonial sees the socialism of the West as a kind of privilege and as a fruit of exploitation, but it also sees socialism as part of his own answer or her own answer. And that, I think, is something that we'll discuss in the context of your presentation. The other question is impossible to really answer, but it is, of course, completely valid. Namely, that in this historical genealogy, I'm looking at socialisms which emerge at different stages of capitalist development. And their whole intellectual apparatus, their idea of technology, their idea of communication, their idea of organization, everything is linked to that epoch of capitalism. And now we're in a different epoch. And so in that sense, the course really should be 14 sessions of silence, unless we really can give entirely new answers to the question what to do now given the neoliberal version's crisis, which of course implies a world with new communication technologies, new forms of organization, new norms, new international relations, which are all very different than anything that Saint-Simon or Comte or Marx even, or the Marx saw the world a little more than they did, could have imagined. And that's true even for the Bolsheviks, who were very international, but who really looked at it from a point of view of concepts which were emerged in the context of Europe. I can't answer that question except to admit that it is right, that we'd have to have a seminar like this on capitalism, basically, or contemporary capitalism, to be able to deal with this question of what kind of socialism is appropriate now. Now, it's true that Karl Polanyi and Keynes even in his own way invented some kind of socialist answer to the crisis of that capitalism. But I'm not Keynes. You know, I can't do what he did. I'd love to be able to develop a new economic theory of how intervention, markets, self-management, different forms of property could be linked in an entirely new kind of world that we're in. But this is something that, so I think that maybe it will be a collective product emerging at some point in this. Well, that's really, that question has very different aspects. I mean, the simplest one is, would I vote for Podemos? Yes.
Yeah, well,
If I were living there,
the option is
I would
both,
vote
yes,
for
that's
Podemos. I would not expect really very dramatic things, but I think that they are, you know, fairly well led. They have some good reforms in mind. They're better on the Catalan question than most of the other parties, so I'd have no difficulty with that. Now, I don't know if Chantal Mouffe is right in trying to push populism, left populism, as a frame within which they should formulate their project. Because if you do that, then you don't need anything more than what they already do, right? And I think that that there are some real issues which one needs to handle in the longer and probably even in the shorter term. And in that sense, I don't see there a new reconstruction of a socialist tradition, just a kind of pragmatic tinkering with where Spanish socialism is right now, which is a fairly conservative version already, right? So in a way, they bring back Spanish socialism to what it was, probably less radical even than in the earlier days. That's a reason to vote for somebody. I mean, obviously, I hope none of you expect utopia here if by a miracle Bernie Sanders wins the election or Elizabeth Warren. We're going to see some pragmatic tinkering with the American system, which is good, by the way, because think about, that's why I talk about long and short term in my paper. Every one of these short term things has to do with thousands, if not even millions of lives, right? To somewhat improve the American healthcare system could be seen as tinkering with Obamacare, which is what it will be. If either Warren or Sanders win, they get a Senate majority, then they'll wind up tinkering with Obamacare, because you can't introduce very easily in a setting in which so many interests are connected to the other private system. But that would mean, even if that's all that happens, is a question of millions of lives. So I think we should take that seriously. But on the other hand, you know, to mobilize so many young people as Sanders does, and I think Warren too, it's just at somewhat different milieu. It's possible because in some ways the people who are mobilized expect more than just that. And that more needs to be some ways responded to keep the political commitment, to keep searching for newer reforms, because if one short-term program is realized, as in the case of European social democracy, what to do next? We read a book by Crossland with Ross Poole in the previous course, and Crossland raises the question, well, we did all the things that T.H. Marshall and other British socialists wanted to do. What to do now? And he says, well, I don't really know. Of course, what happened then is Thatcherism, because in the new European and international setting, even what they achieved up to that point was difficult to maintain. And then, of course, came the response. But I think one would have been able to better deal with that if one would have been able to say, now that we have this, we could have, for example, I didn't say British Labour never stressed this, we could have much more industrial democracy, right? We could have much more industrial democracy and accountability on that level. We could have a much greater protection of consumers. We could have more political democracy, which builds on the grassroots, which are never really well developed in the UK. But they didn't say those things. So I think one of the reasons why Podemos is still a problem is that they sort of probably do, I don't know Spain at all, they probably give people the idea that they really are about to do much more than just standard social democracy. But eventually one has to name that thing. Eventually one has to articulate it and begin to deliver on it, even if pragmatically, step by step. And I think the only reason why Bernie Sanders is so convincing here with a fairly pragmatic program is because the US welfare state is so underdeveloped. Now, you could not be Bernie Sanders in Denmark with his program. But free tuition at state universities, the Danes have it. Universal health care, everybody's insured at relatively high level and low. The Danes have it. So I think Denmark, and what did the Danish socialists do in order to address the problem? They cracked down on immigration. So instead of offering something really, which then begins to say, well, that's, even in Denmark, which is in some respects paradisical next to the United States, that's a small country, it's a different matter. But still, even in Denmark, there could be a lot of things one could do, or one could imagine. But since they don't, they say, well, we'll be tough on immigrants too, because we don't really want others to so easily share in the good things we already have given to ethnic Danes, or not ethnic Danes, but people who have been living here a long time. So I think in that sense, Syriza, Podemos, Sanders should be voted for, given, you don't want to throw your vote away to some sectarian alternative that has no chance at all. But at the same time, we should criticize them, and at least those who are capable, and that's not me, should begin to try to formulate projects for them. And that's something that probably there are people in all these countries who do. I mean, in that sense, even Five Star in Italy, which was a very crazy mixture of different things, but nevertheless it tried to dramatically formulate what would be a way of politically including the population in decision making. That in itself is a good idea, although I think that a purely electronic version of that is not really convincing, but there would be other ways. Okay.